The Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Allawi. Chapter 11. The Last Crisis. Islam has entered the world a stranger, and it will return a stranger. Saying of the Prophet Muhammad. Abu Naim al-Isfahani. Hilyat al-Awliya wa Tabakat al-Asfiya. Dar al-Rayyan Publishers, Beirut, 1987, Volume 2, page 10. For centuries, the civilization of Islam has been buffeted by powerful adverse currents which have succeeded in draining its vitality and have gradually whittled it down to a shadow of its former self. The most disturbing, far-reaching, and possibly fatal of these currents has been the panoply of disruptive forces associated with the imperial expansion of the West into Muslim lands and with the blast of modernity that accompanied it. A third giant wave, that of globalization, different in form from the mainly political and military challenges of the past, is now cresting over the world of Islam. The global reach of impersonal forces has not spared Muslims or Muslim countries. These forces have rendered ambiguous the traditional boundaries between cultures and civilizations. The information explosion, global economic integration, and the spread of mass media are all examples of powerful currents which ignore the circumvent civilizational frontiers. The demand for a continuous improvement in the economic lot of the people is now most universal. Technological prowess, economic vitality, and increasing standards of living are what mostly determine the rankings of the nations and peoples, to which might be added the culture of democracy and rights. Muslims and the civilization they created have been hurled into these turbulent and unfamiliar waters. Islam as a religion and Islamic civilization as the world which Muslims have created and in which they have lived have been tested for their validity, adaptability, and ability to hold on to the loyalty of Muslims. The ferment in the Islamic world over the past 200 years has been symptomatic of the deep-seated anxieties which have accompanied these disruptive forces. The three broad cycles which have marked this period, the shock of modernity, the effective break with the past, and the counter-revolution which these have inspired, have led to the profound changes in the way Muslims understand and even practice their faith. However, while the faith has proved resilient in its ability to confront and resolve the challenges coming its way, the fate of the civilization itself gives far less cause for optimism. Though religion is the defining feature of Islamic civilization and its main drive, it is not its entirety. It is the other props of the civilization that have atrophied and died. Islamic civilization is now nearly bereft of the most of vital elements that had previously given it coherence and meaning. Whatever has remained is now undergoing its last crisis. Islamic civilization will either suffer the fate of previous world civilizations which have disappeared as living entities, or will find within itself the capability to redefine the meaning of civilized life and metamorphose in ways now not entirely evident. The last crisis. No one can dismiss the fervor and commitment with which Muslims at large have tried to grapple with the myriad issues their civilization had to contend with in the recent past. Equally striking, however, is the absence of any continuity and depth to the various reforms and modernizing schemes that have marked Islam's response to the waves of change engulfing it. The short-lived period when traditionalists were still in control ended with the total defeat of these champions of Islam and in their banishment or death. The likes of Abdul Qadir, the Sunisia of Libya, and Imam Shamil disappeared into memory. Their hopeless jihads may have kindled a romantic yearning for epic deeds unsullied by modern ways, but it was their very traditionalism that was held to be responsible for their ultimate defeat. Modernists such as Afghani Abduh and Ridha neither upgraded the capacity of Islam to respond to the encroachments of the West, nor succeeded in harmonizing their version of Islam with the precepts of the modern order. In the end, some of them, such as Ridha, would turn against the ideals of a reformed Islam and opt for the purer Salafi variety as the only way to revive the world of Islam. Secularists who had run over the lands of Islam for nearly 50 years were equally unable to refashion their societies in the European secular mold. Religion did not vanish from their societies in spite of the often draconian measures to eliminate its presence. Neither has the effort of the last 2 or 3 decades to create the basis of a new Islamic civilization been any more successful. The constant degrading of the main tenets of Islamic civilization has continued apace, in spite of the heroic and often solitary attempts to fashion a new understanding of the wellsprings of Islamic civilization and to create the circumstances and opportunities for its regeneration. Benabi's critique of Islamic civilization left little in the form of a determined program to reverse the pernicious effects of the centuries of stasis of the vitality and creativity of Muslims. The Islamization of knowledge movement was pioneered by Al-Atas, Al-Faruqi, and others, has sputtered on with a few ambitious publications on Islamizing social sciences. Their effects have been marginal. Liberal reformers of the religion have basically conceded the argument that Muslims are best served if they assume the democratic and liberal verities of the West as their own. Islamic sciences has gone the way of Islamic architecture, Islamic city planning, Islamic medicine, and Islamic economics. It is either spoken of in the past tense or it stumbles along with a few adherents and with little or no vitality. As each aspect of Islamic civilization has withered away, the remaining few necessarily assume greater significance and increasingly become its defining features. The cultures of Islam continue. They are increasingly parochial and national, linked to racial or ethnic identities and loyalties rather than manifestations of a universal civilization. The formerly universal Islamic civilization is now reduced to two elements that still retain a real vitality and can cross the frontiers of nations and peoples: the religious world of the faithful and pious, and the political world of power and government. For many people, these become the only extant routes through which Islamic civilization may yet be recreated. The spiritual or inner lives of Muslims have shrunk in favor of an Islam based on rules and rituals. Both political Islam and the various fundamentalist orthodoxies privilege the outer forms of piety and observance as a confirmation of the existence of an Islamic basis to society. So do the various autocracies and pseudo-democracies that rule in the Muslim world. It is easy to burnish one's Islamic credentials by building giant mosques and by ostentatiously celebrating the various festivals of Islam. The spread of Quranic channels and religious programs is another aspect of concern with the outer manifestation of Islamism. They are improbable platforms for the rediscovery of inner ethics from which a new civilizational impulse can originate. Secularists in Muslim world tend to be frightened by these outer forms of Islamic observance, seeing in them the thin edge of the wedge for the imposition of full-blown Sharia law. If Islamists were to come to power, Sharia law merely compounds secularists' anxieties about the dangers inherent in creeping Islamization of society. Secularists see both as merely way stations to the dismantling of the modern social and cultural mores adopted by many Muslims. Sharia law is seen to restrict radically the possibility of a modern lifestyle, but conformity to a supposedly Islamic outer norm, such as that manifested in forcing or cajoling women to wear headscarves in public, cannot be the way to reconstruct a civilization, although many would combine the two and see one as a precondition for the other. There are few signs that the outer aspects of Islamic observance are under threat. There is no crisis of religious belief in Islam comparable to the one that has affected, say, Christianity in the West. Mosques are not closing down because of lack of custom, neither has religion been effectively banned from the public space. Allegiance to Islam has not only survived the modern period, but has in fact strengthened. But this is a long way from asserting that the seeds for the rebirth of Islamic civilization are there simply because most Muslims continue to exhibit an extraordinary commitment to their religion. The last crisis of Islamic civilization, the one that will put a definitive end to the civilizational cycle which began with the establishment of Islam as a distinct cultural, political, and religious community, will not come from the mass abandonment of religious faith. The fortunes of Islamic civilization are linked more to the success or demise of political Islam. The politicization of Islam and its turning into an ideology for achieving power is an undoubted pivotal change that has influenced the course of Muslim life and civilization in modern times. However, when Islamists proclaim that Islam is a total way of life, what they really mean is that Islamic forms should shroud the modern world. There is no serious questioning about the underlying conceptual framework of this world. The high ground of implicity acknowledging the authority of the modern framework has already been conceded. The introduction of Sharia, for example, becomes a mechanism by which outer Islamic forms are sustained and sanctioned. In fact, Islamists proclaim their belief in a scientific and progressive Islam as a badge of honor, implicitly adopting the world view of science and the merits of unrestricted technological change. They frequently use their rationalist credentials to advance their claim that they can manage state and society more effectively than others. In power, it is unlikely that Islamists will generate a new dynamic in Islamic civilization. The claim to see the outer world is an entirely different light rings hollow if one has accepted the underlying assumptions of the modern world. The evolution of modernity owes virtually nothing to Islam, and Islamists have proved utterly indifferent to alternative forms of modernity which are being explored by many groups in the world. It is relatively simple to ban the consumption of alcohol or to change the penal codes in the name of the Sharia. It is an entirely different matter to conceive of an alternative way of ordering people's lives or of radically changing people's sense of values. The success of political Islam may paradoxically prove to be the last crisis of Islamic civilization, for it will remove once and for all the possibility that the political route could ever be the basis for rejuvenating or refashioning the elements of a new form of Islamic civilization. The turn to violence and terror by a small part of the Islamist movement, especially its signature mass murders of innocent civilians, is another decisive break with the Islam's civilizational legacy. Islam's detractors make the claim that there is a linear connection between the two best known terrorist phenomena in Islamic history, the Khawarij and the medieval sect of assassins, and their modern day equivalent. This is to stretch the connection to a breaking point. 1. The Khawarij reaches to the early years of Islam's foundation, to the wars between Ali and Muawiyah, and for control over the caliphate. The other connection with the assassins is superficially more justifiable. They were possibly the first such movement to use terror in a systematic way to achieve political ends. As for the modern counterparts, they have relied on angry and disaffected individuals to forge a violent and disciplined organization driven by a messianic ideology. But the assassins are defeated when their final strongholds were overwhelmed in the 13th century and the traces of organized terrorism vanished from the world of Islam until very recent times. The latter-day terrorists of the Al-Qaeda and other jihadi organizations can as easily be connected to the nihilist and terrorist movements of Tsarist Russia or to the post-war groups that blurred the boundaries between legitimate national and social liberation struggles and terrorism, whether in Indochina, Sri Lanka, Palestine, Peru, Algeria, or Southern Africa. The turn to violence from extreme Islamist groups is also symptomatic of an inability to address the problems of the Islamic world in the context of traditional legacy of Islam. When all of Islamdom is seen to have surrendered to the ways of the modern world, the only open route to effect changes becomes the political. When, for whatever reason, this is blocked, the recourse to violence becomes almost inevitable. But this is self-contradictory. The tabula rasa that extreme Islamists expect to find after their victory is based on the denial of the existence of any vital aspects to Islam's legacy at present. In many ways, therefore, the recourse to terrorism in the name of a grand civilization confirms the disappearance of that civilization from the consciousness of the terrorists and their supporters. The last crisis of Islamic civilization are upon us. Private faith, public religiosity. Terrorists who use Islam as a political ideology and as a cover for their activities will probably be defeated in the near future. The combination of US military power and the national security and military apparatus of a range of countries will prevail over the threats posed by the likes of Al-Qaeda and its jihadi offshoots. The political course of Islam will then revolve around two possible outcomes. The first are the on-off attempts to shrink Islam and relegate it to the private sphere and to resist or reject its spread, even in symbolic matters, into the political domain. In nations of the Muslim world where secularism has put down deep roots, whether Turkey or the former Soviet Central Asian republics, the public domain will not easily be given over to Islam. The electoral success of the Muslim Democratic AK party in Turkey has been met by a powerful counter-response from the secular establishment entrenched in the state bureaucracy and in the judiciary. The fracas over wearing of headscarves by women students inside university campuses is an example of this. The AK party used its huge parliamentary majority to reverse the ban on the wearing of headscarves, only to see the state prosecutor counter with a lawsuit which demanded the dissolution of the party and the banning of its leaders, including the country's president and prime minister. Similarly, the fierce response by the leaders of Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan to any overt public manifestation of anything but a sanitized Islam is a reminder that decades of Soviet rule and Tsarist tutelage have created a powerful political class determined to keep Islam at bay. In many of the democracies of the Western Europe, a strong current is building up to reverse the multiculturalism which has the hallmark of post-war policies geared towards Muslims and other minorities. These policies, by and large, allowed the expression of Islamic sentiment and allegiance at public level. Starting with the French ban on wearing headscarves by Muslim school children, the new current has now extended to a variety of other aspects of the public life for which exceptions were made or special privileges were allowed for the benefit of Muslims. Even in Britain, which still clings to a frayed version of multiculturalism, there are now serious doubts about the wisdom of allowing for Muslim exceptionalisms in social policies. For example, public outrage met the Archbishop of Canterbury's thoughtful comments about the possibility of adjusting family law for Muslim Britishers so as to accommodate the Sharia's ruling on these matters. At the same time, there are now serious efforts both in Western Europe and in Turkey to encourage a new reading of the Sharia designed specifically to generate a moderate version of the faith. The ultimate purpose of secularization of Islam would be to reduce its domain to the private sphere as an individual faith or, at best, a community faith. It might inform an individual's actions and decisions, but Islam will not form the basis of any ordering of society or politics. This will bring Islam to the same condition that other non-established religions have in the modern world. In time, the singularity of Islam will disappear, and with it, any possibility of its outer expression having any serious impact on the world at large. Islam would then lose whatever claim it might have to be the incubator of a unique form of a future civilization. Individual Muslims would then participate in a world which would carry no imprint of their religion. They might still claim the historical civilization of Islam as their patrimony, but Islam as such would not feature in the structuring of the outer world they dwell in. The world would have moved on, being driven by other forces with which Islam has only a distant and tangential relation. Islam might influence individuals either as a moral guide or as a source of inspiration, for example, in specific art forms such as calligraphy or building decoration. But it will no longer define the Muslim's universe. A secularized Islam destroys the essential balance inherent to Islam between the individual and the collective. The Islamization of public life in a large number of Muslim countries provides an opposite set of problems for the prospects for Islam as a civilization. The identification of the state with increased religiosity in the Muslim world has led to the adoption of official policies to promote the role of Islam in public life. However, this has been restricted to the outer aspects such as religious observance and the encouragement of widespread conformity to an officially sanctioned form of Islam. The status of ulamas is enhanced. The patterns of the workplace are changed to accommodate the times of prayers. Subtle pressures are applied to enforce a dress code on women. Religious terms and invocations are included in all official functions. All these combine to create a powerful image of a society in which Islam is not only honored but privileged. But these are at best incidental to the issue at hand, and at worst, they produce a false appreciation of the significance of Islamization of public life. Ostentatiously loud calls to prayers in the middle of a glittering shopping mall or supermarket cannot disguise the real fact that the markets people visit daily now follow models drawn from outside of Islam. Most banks in the Muslim world now have a special room for offering prayers. The irony is lost on most people that the very existence of interest-based financial institutions is deeply problematic in Islam. Adding a prayer room may be a sop to the religious sensibilities of the employees, but it does not eliminate the obvious contradiction. Encouraging women to wear the headscarf as a sign of modesty and religious observance is completely negated by the spread of the designer hijab as a fashion statement. These conflicts and contradictions abound, but they only help to disguise the almost universal acknowledgement, albeit implicit, that the sources and models of change and development in these societies are now almost entirely based on standards that are incidental to Islam. It is also unclear how the adoption of Sharia law will advance the cause of recreating the foundations of a new Islamic civilization. Sharia might allow Muslims to order their outer affairs and transactions according to a system that still commands a powerful legitimacy and has many adherents, possibly most of the world's Muslims. Many see it as the best chance for Muslim countries to eliminate despotic power and live under legitimate rule of law. Recent surveys indicate that a good majority in countries as diverse as Egypt, Pakistan, and Jordan want Sharia as their only source of legislation. Notwithstanding the immense problems in establishing the full gamut of Sharia law in countries and societies which have lived for decades outside of it, the issue of Sharia law affects only one aspect of Islamic civilization: the institutional framework of lawmaking, justice, politics, and government. These issues are immensely significant, no doubt, but they are not the entire story of Islamic civilization. Sharia rule is in Muslim countries might remold the forms in which some aspects of modern life is conducted, but it will not necessarily produce a new Islamic civilizational force. Islam and an alternative modernity. All this would seem to indicate that Muslims may have abandoned the creative role Islam can play in mapping out a path for the future in all its manifestations. In many ways, this would be a betrayal of Muslims' legacy and a terrible failure of imagination. All the great religious traditions are experiencing a reinvigorated engagement with the modern world, not so much to come to terms with it, but rather to address the huge range of problems that have arisen precisely because of it. In the field, Islam is noted for its absence. Muslims are, at best, bystanders in the great crisis of the modern era. From the environmental risks the planet is running to the problems of overpopulation, impoverishment, and mass migration. The leadership in tackling these issues is left to others, while Muslims remain mostly mute and ineffectual. There are extraordinary social reformers and visionaries in the Muslim world, for instance, Abdus Sattar Idi and his emergency medical services in Pakistan, or Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Bangladesh's microfinance institution, the Grameen Bank. However, these remain the exception rather than the rule. But it is in these very areas that Islam can make a great impact on mankind as a whole and confirm its continuing relevance in the modern period. The fact that Islam did not participate in the evolution of modernity does not imply that it cannot participate or even lead in the resolution of the crises which are plaguing the world by positioning and alternative vision for the future. This vision would be drawn from Islam's own essence as a religion, as a spiritualized worldview, and as a metaphysics which emphasizes the element of balance in the ordering of the lives and relationships of human beings. This aspect of Islam has been seriously overlooked in the modern period, as the Muslims have focused excessively on the issue of powerlessness and on the threats to the integrity of their religion. A great number of social, economic, and environmental ills that affect the world are related to the imbalances which have become intrinsic to the prevailing order. Prior predictions of the past, from the Malthusian nightmare of an overpopulation facing finite resources to the 1970s Club of Rome prognostications about the collapse of oil reserves, have so far proved to be baseless. Technological innovations and improvements in the processes, techniques, and management have played a crucial part in eliminating these risks. It is true, and technology may once again come to the rescue of mankind's excesses, but this time around the crisis is likely to be more dreadful. There is growing recognition that over-reliance on technological advancement to resolve the outer manifestation of imbalances without tackling their fundamental causes may have run its course. It is inconceivable, for example, that the entire world can attain the present standards of consumption of the developed countries without a dramatic effect on the balance of resources, global warming, and the distribution of wealth and income. If the entire population of China and India were to attain American standards of car ownerships and energy consumption, the world's present reserves of oil, coal, and iron ore would probably disappear very shortly thereafter. The planet would gradually become uninhabitable as the world's economic powers scramble to control the finite resources and demand the right to overconsume and overexploit them. The economic growth that many developing countries have experienced over the past decade is at risk of being entirely wiped out by the sudden rise in commodity, raw material, and fuel prices, and by the tsunami that has engulfed the global financial system. This augurs an increasing fragility and instability in the world economy. The situation cannot be rectified simply by assuming that market forces, by signaling the presence of scarcities and by directing resources to areas where these might represent a potential profit, will induce the requisite technological response to expand supply. The expectations of limitless material growth must be tempered by the imperative of managing the world's resources in a fair way and providing reasonable opportunity for the world's impoverished peoples to rise out of their unacceptable condition. The need to alter the perceptions and convictions of people about what constitutes the good life, therefore, becomes almost a prerequisite to navigating through the crisis the world is facing and to reaching a sustainable resolution for them. The strings of an alternative modernity are already evident, go beyond the espousal by celebrities of fashionable global causes or the empty slogans which reduce the real distress of millions of people to the sound bites of marketers. The interconnectedness of things is becoming clearer as the world is knitted ever closer by the forces of globalization. Demand for fuel by very rapidly growing economies lead to a sky-high oil prices. These prompt the developed world to push for biofuel subsidies. This in turn drives up worldwide grain prices. These cause food riots in poor countries. While oil producers with scant populations pile up huge cash hoards for which they have no earthly use. Their native populations already enjoy huge personal incomes, guaranteed employment, free education and healthcare, and subsidized housing, all financed by a fraction of the oil revenues. The economic growth which has accompanied globalization begins to lose its luster if its benefits are disproportionately distributed. In a 2005 report, the UN estimated that the income of the 50 richest people on earth is greater than that of the 400 million poorest. The examples can be multiplied. The mass rejection from the modern mindset of the cardinal virtues, not least wisdom and moderation, seems to be complete. But the world cannot anymore sustain the cult of the rampant individual except at its peril. There are too many externalities and costs for which other individuals, communities, and countries have to pay the price. The model of the Promethean man, heroically challenging the gods and broking no limits to his desires and their fulfillment, has to come to an end. The rugged, autonomous individual, so beloved by liberal philosophers and by Hollywood movies, simply cannot exist outside the virtuous community. And Islam would add that neither the individual nor the society can be whole if they are not infused with the sense of the transcendent. The wheel returns full circle. Nature of Islam's mystical knowledge. The sense of the transcendent in Islam was always nurtured by the acknowledgement of the realities of mystical knowledge. The modern mind is skeptical and unable to grasp the structures of mystical knowledge. The same skepticism, if not downright hostility towards Islam's legacy of mystical thought, embraces modern-day Muslims, and this includes liberal, reformist, and fundamentalist Muslims. Some formal lip service may be paid to mystical knowledge for no other reason than it belongs in the panoply of Islamic thought. It is in fact central to the understanding of Islam. The decline in the practice of Sufism and the distancing of the rationalizing Shia mujtahids from the esoteric aspects of Islam have pushed this knowledge to the outer periphery of Islamic consciousness, and it has remained there while Muslim intellectuals and scholars have tried reforming the Sharia or rationalizing Islamic consciousness as future pathways for Muslims. There is, of course, a great deal of superstition, mythologizing, and absurdities in the mystical currents in Islam, but these occur when tradition decays and loses its interpretive vitality. In a system of beliefs which rests ultimately on the human understanding of the divine text and on the revelatory experience, Inspiration is an authentic source of interpretation and validation. The unseen cannot be approached solely by reason and authoritative textual interpretations. The fact that this current, which recognizes the transcendent, has been degraded over time, does not alter this truth. Islam needs a new understanding of religion based on intuitive reasoning precisely because the relevance of the religion will founder without it. So, a spiritualized language for Islam is essential if the creative potential is to be regained. For all its eclecticism, Iqbal's treatment of the dynamic self as seeking its freedom so as to perfect God's attributes offers an example of the type of spiritualized terminology that can draw nearer two different and hitherto incompatible understandings of human freedom. Such terminology can combine the heroic with the ethical in the same individual, but the quest for a spiritualized language for Islam must leap across centuries, since Islamic reformers and thinkers have almost ignored the possibility of reviving the mystical side of Islam. Unlike the voluminous writings on reforming the Sharia or rationalizing Islam, a lexicon of modern Islamic Gnosis simply does not exist. It needs to be almost reinvented as its categories, terms, concepts, and meanings have languished except in very narrow philosophical circles and amongst a few of the Cognoscenti who have a taste for this type of knowledge. It has not helped either that metaphysical Sufism, which is encompassed by this knowledge, has had a checkered history and is subject to periodic attacks from the clerical classes and the Wahhabi or Salafi community. But metaphysical Sufism can provide genuine insights into the nature of reality by cultivating a spirituality of the imagination. The Western tradition has left the mystical tradition behind in its attempt to dominate nature, but the imaginary continues to exert a powerful attraction on the West. And not only through consciousness raising methods such as meditation or other self-awareness or self-realization techniques. The Western experience has detached self-awareness from knowledge of God, partly because of the general hostility, suspicion, and indifference to religious structures of thought. Self-knowledge movements have succeeded in attracting huge followings, mainly because they do not claim to offer anything beyond the individual's own self-improvement through the adoption and practice of certain techniques. They have no serious social or collective effect. The revival of the inner dimensions of Islam cannot be restricted to being simply a matter of method and technique or the elaboration of an ideology of metaphysical spirituality. Knowledge of God is at the heart of the Islamic Sufi tradition, and its modernization must acknowledge the prior existence of a visionary realm where God's reality is also manifested. Access to and understanding of this realm has its own unique conceptual and linguistic tools and is essential for the evolution of this most ignored aspect of Islam. The definition of man in Islam's mystical tradition starts with the recognition that human beings combine in their persons opposing characteristics. Humans are spiritual as well as corporeal, luminous and dense, subtle and gross, creative and destructive. Which aspect prevails is directly related to the goals and choices that human beings assign for themselves as they progress through life. They start in a condition of ignorance but can realize a potential for knowledge. They may be despicable and mean but have the capability of being generous and magnanimous. Their beginning and end is determined by the inevitability of certain death, but also by the choices they make between their caprices and desires on the one hand and the attainment of God's attributes on the other. On the one hand, a human being is no different from an animal. On the other hand, he or she can aspire to the highest forms of knowledge. The range of options is infinite, as are the possible outcomes, but the true seeker knows that, in the end, perfecting the qualities of God within oneself is the sole purpose of existence. These qualities or attributes are built in, as it were, into human primordial nature, a type of spiritual DNA. It is only by actualizing these qualities in an arc of spiritual ascent during one's lifetime that human beings can partake in the fullness of existence. Achieving such states or doing good becomes a fundamental part of realizing the potentially divine within the human beings. This is the definition of what constitutes a full human being, rather than solely the sentient or rational being of the humanists or philosophers. These traits cannot be acquired since they are already there inside. Virtues are not immutable ethical principles that coexist alongside human beings. They represent the essence of the encounter between man and God, and they are the bridge that connects the human with the divine. But while they are imprinted into the fabric of a human being, they stay latent until they are activated by the individual's striving to realize and perfect them. Ethical action, therefore, is not divinely ordained. Rather, the divine reality is reached through ethical action. If one seeks to reach God, then one must act ethically. The ethics of spiritualized Islam are based on a foundation of courtesy and modesty. Courtesy towards the names and attributes of God, modesty in terms of the individual's affirmation that these traits are God's alone. A person can aspire to perfect them, but their full measure will always belong to God alone. Some of God's attributes cannot be reproduced in human, for instance, his oneness or his everlastingness. Others are such as mercy, compassion, gentleness, and beauty. Courtesy regarding God's attributes also implies recognition of their hierarchical nature. Mercy precedes wrath. Knowledge precedes action, and so on. The significance of courtesy lies in its being not only a guide to human action, but also in its scaling of justice, where fairness, clemency, and punishment must be balanced appropriately. Nevertheless, the moral drive which generates actions of the ethical human being cannot be left unregulated and entirely answerable to reason or whim. The Sharia, in the broadest sense of the word, becomes the means to effect the true and lasting guidance for the ethical individual. The word Sharia is derived from the Arabic root shar, which means road or path. So, the Sharia is etymologically the pathway to guidance and felicity. For a spiritualized Muslim, the Sharia is not limited to formal rules and strictures. It is the path of prophets, messengers, and friends of God. They have mapped the right roads to follow and the wrong roads to avoid. In fact, the search for the correct path to follow is an inner primordial impulse that exists alongside the latent noble traits of God in human beings. It must also emerge as part of the full spiritual flowering of a human being. Man seeks justice to perfect God's trait of being the all just, but must also seek the correct course through the minefields of the outer world. Human beings can easily be overwhelmed and surrender to the turmoil in the outer world, where conflict, doubt, uncertainty, and ambiguity seems to prevail.